Hello, everybody. My name is Pablo Boczkowski. I'm a faculty member at Northwestern University and the director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It is truly a pleasure to have you with us. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx and Latin American communities across the Americas. Today's speaker is a leading scholar in this space. David Nemer is an assistant professor of media studies and affiliated faculty in Latin American studies at the University of Virginia. Daniel Trielli, a doctoral candidate at Northwestern University and an affiliate at the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce David in just a minute. I am delighted to note that this quarter, our series is co-sponsored by the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, the Center for Global Culture and Communication, the Department of Communication Studies, the Department of Radio, Television, and Film, the Latina and Latino Studies program, and the program in Latin American and Caribbean Studies. But before we go into the seminar, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about Native peoples and the institution's history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Let me say briefly a little bit more about how the seminar will unfold. First, in just a minute, Daniel will tell us more about David's research and career in just a minute. Then David will deliver his seminar, and after that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar at the bottom of the screen. At any point in time, you can do that during the seminar. Daniel will moderate afterwards. At the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us. And without further ado, Daniel, the screen is all yours.
Thank you very much, Pablo. I am very thrilled and honored to introduce today's speaker, Dr. David Nemer, who is an assistant professor of media studies and an affiliate faculty in Latin American studies at the University of Virginia, and also a Brazilian like me. In his 2013 book, Favela Digital, The Other Side of Technology, he uses images of the favelas paired with ethnographical observations written in English and Portuguese to explore the alternative use of digital technology in the favelas of Vitoria, in the beautiful state of Espírito Santo in Brazil. His forthcoming book, Technology of the Oppressed, Inequity and the Digital Mundane in the Favelas of Brazil, which will be published in both Portuguese and English, further investigates how residents in the favelas appropriate the technologies to fight against oppression. He also studies the intersection between disinformation and politics in Brazil, and has often published articles on this topic on El País, Intercept Brazil, and The Guardian. He is also required following on Twitter if you're interested in disinformation Brazil and the Bolsonaro family in that environment, if I may add, as a personal parenthetical. I look forward to hearing more about his work and his talk, and I'm sure we all have a lot of questions for him. Throughout the talk, you can all submit your questions via the Zoom Q&A tool, and we'll cover them in the Q&A session. But for now, Professor Nemer, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Pablo, so much for the nice introduction. I appreciate the land acknowledgement. And as you mentioned, I'm at the University of Virginia, which is situated in the Monacan Indian Nation. So I'd like to acknowledge that and pay respect for those who came before us. So today I have the challenge of summarizing my book in one presentation. The book's going to be published by MIT in February of 2022. And there are many things here that I thought about compressing, but for the sake of time, I won't have the time. But please feel free to ask questions in the end. I'll be happy to answer them. But okay, so the book's called Technology of the Oppressed, and it's not a coincidence that the title of this book is reminiscent of Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Paulo Freire, for those who don't know, was a Brazilian educationalist and philosopher whose radical idea about pedagogy, learning, and knowledge established the critical pedagogy movement. Freire's philosophy came not only from classical approaches stemming from Plato, he was also inspired by existential phenomenologists, modern Marxists, and anti-colonialist thinkers. So oftentimes, as I bring Paulo Freire in order to frame the technology of the oppressed, I often get asked if my book is about instructional or educational technologies, and I say no, because Freire himself became very dissatisfied with how his ideas were approached as a methodology. So he said once to an interview with Donaldo Macedo, he said, "I don't want to be imported or exported. It is impossible to export pedagogical practices without reinventing them. Ask scholars to recreate and rewrite my ideas." So Freire's invitation to others to reinvent his ideas inspired me to develop a framework that seeks to understand why digital technologies can be simultaneously sites of oppression and tools that can be appropriated by the oppressed in their pursuit of freedom. I use the term mundane technology to describe this framework. It doesn't provide a method or a set of techniques to liberate the oppressed, nor it is a pedagogical plan. Rather, I conceptualize mundane technology as an episteme to understand oppression in Freire's process of conscientization, or to becoming aware, in the information age. So, in order to understand oppression, we must comprehend what constitutes the relationship between the oppressed and the oppressor. So according to Freire, one of the fundamental elements is prescription. So guidelines that impose the consciousness of the prescriber, the oppressor, upon the consciousness of the prescribed, which are the oppressed. In other words, the behavior of the oppressed is defined and shaped by the oppressor, a form of control that impedes their achieving freedom. So prescription, as also claimed by Bruno Latour, can also be imposed by non-human actors, such as technological artifacts, to dictate human action. Thus, in favelas, prescriptions are not only imposed through laws and boundaries, but also designed into algorithms and technological affordances of digital technologies. So, given an understanding that technology can mask and deepen oppression, the question that I raise is, in my book and in this talk, is how can favela residents use digital technologies in their quest to liberate themselves and regain their humanities? So to address this question, in this book, I animate stories of humans living in favelas of Brazil, which is a site of oppression, who creatively and critically appropriated technologies in their journey to fight liberations. And I call this mundane technology. So I did not coin the term mundane technology. It has actually been explored by previous scholars interested in understanding the role of technology in everyday life. So Paul Dorish, for example, referred to mundane technologies as those that are commonplace, which many people use, such as smartphones, texting, email, word processing applications, and so on. So Mike Michael suggests that the term mundane technologies connotes those technologies whose novelty has worn off. These are technologies which are now fully integrated into and are unremarkable part of everyday life. So Trevor Pinch and David Edgerton have called for a move away from innovation-driven studies of technology to studies of the mundane technologies, because they have become so integral to everyday use that it is often difficult to identify what is anthropologically and sociologically relevant about them. So while I borrow the notion of mundane technology in this book, I expand the term to go beyond digital artifacts to refer to the process of appropriating everyday technologies to alleviate oppressions in their everyday lives. And these everyday technologies can be technological artifacts like smartphones, Facebook, operations such as repair and maintenance, as well as space like telecenters and the so-called land houses, which are similar to cyber cafes. So mundane technologies encompass non-productive everyday activities and desires that people engage in. They constitute a decolonial framework for understanding how people exercise their agency and consciousness, or conscientization, and appropriate technologies to mobilize themselves towards a quality of life they desire. So in my book, I animate stories of humans living in favelas of Vitoria who creatively and critically appropriated technologies in their journey to find liberations. So as I mentioned, I conducted this work, which is a long-term ethnography in the city of Vitoria. Vitoria is the state capital of Espírito Santo. I don't know, oftentimes when we talk about Brazil, people tend to focus in Rio and Sao Paulo. Daniel is from Sao Paulo, so he knows what I'm talking about. Vitoria is, it's still in the southeast region, which is the richest area of Brazil. However, it's hard to attract attention to Vitoria because it's often competing with the three largest cities in the country, which are Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, and Belo Horizonte. I am from Vitoria, and I thought this was a good, this research I thought was a good way to put Vitoria on the map, specifically in the literature here in the US. Vitoria, as you can see, it's a pretty island, and we emphasize the word island because on the map, it's hard to see, and we're proud of it. As you can see here on the map, it's barely an island, and it's actually inside of a bay. But that's what makes us special. So we are very proud to be from an island. And the city, it's a rich city. It has, the fourth highest GDP per capita, and also the second highest human development in the country. But these numbers are misleading because Vitoria has also the second highest concentration of wealth, which means that the rich is very rich, but the poor is very poor. And to understand that, I break down the census data into these very in two maps. This one is by social class. So Brazil, basically, one of the ways to organize the society in Brazil is to divide them in social class based on household income. And of course, those in class A, B, and upper C. I mean, A, B is considered upper class. Class C is middle class, and D, E are lower class. So as you can see on the East Coast, sorry, on the West Coast is where wealth is concentrated, right? Where we have class A and B facing the ocean, whereas we can see the poor are on the other side. Interestingly, when you look into this map that brings household income data, and then try to contrast against the racial divide dividing the country, you can see that it maps not only the socioeconomics, but also the racial disparity, meaning that the rich are white and the poor are black. And the reason why it's important to bring this here is because in Brazil, there is this myth that we only have a problem with socioeconomics, meaning that Brazil is exempt of racism. So Brazilians have a problem with the poor, but not so much with, the blacks and browns. But when you look at a map like this, you can see that the poor is not a coincidence that are the blacks and the browns. So this is just to give you a sense of how the Brazilian society is organized, not only in Vitoria, but in the rest of the country. And also to situate on the map, because Vitoria is not very well known. This green line here is a very famous avenue in Vitoria. It's called Leitão da Silva. So as I put this data together, I realized that something similar to what happened here in the US when people would say on the other side of the tracks, right? Meaning that that's where the poor and the Black communities were situated. The same thing happening in Brazil. So on the other side of the avenue, that's where the poor and the Blacks were kept. And this is important to mention here because we're going to go back to this. So as you can see here on this very center here, which is the concentrations of Blacks and poors, that's exactly where the favelas, where I did my field work, took place. In the book, I call them territory of good, because there's actually an effort to reconceptualize how people see the favelas. And this is actually an idea that came from favela residents. They call themselves território do bem, which is territory of good, and englobes different favelas in different communities. So and these are the favelas that I did my field work, and it was located right in the center of the island. So it wasn't anywhere geographically separated from the city. It was in the city, and yet upper classes, the state and government managed to exclude that area. So just to give you a bit more context, it's not surprising that the favelas were on the hillsides. Just to summarize here, the explanation for this goes back to the imperial times in Brazil. The Portuguese and the colonizers and the rich families occupied flat lands. And because, for farming purposes, Brazil was, a farming country for a long time, still is. And when the enslaved laborers were set free, no compensation, nothing was given to them. So the hillsides, which were not good for farming, were the only available lands that they could occupy. So they occupied those lands. Wasn't just occupying as if it was an easy process. They had to fight and conquer those spaces, but yeah, it was the only space that they could occupy. So this was basically the summary of pretty much every favela on hills in Brazil. So, and in Vitoria, the favelas were organized just like in other favelas, like I said, on hillsides, where the very bottom, that's where we had the shops, the stores, the markets. This was basically considered the shopping center of my field. On the middle, that's where we had the houses, the shack houses, those very straight alleys. If you've seen the movie City of God, then this is basically where the movie spends most of the time. And I don't know if you realize this, but at the very top, it looks empty, right? It's not only because it has hard access, but it was also where the main drug cartel placed themselves. And that was due to many reasons. One, they could watch the territory, they could prepare when rival gangs or the police would come in, so they could hide or attack. Of course, it's easier to attack from the top to bottom than bottom up. The first phase of this ethnography, the second phase of this ethnography happened between April to October in 2013. And that was the worst time to do field work in favelas because as Brazil was going through that state-sponsored quote unquote pacification, which meant that they were doing a social cleansing in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, the drug lords from those places who managed to get away from the cops, they came to Vitoria and they put themselves at war with the cartels that were already established in these favelas. So it wasn't a very peaceful area. It was very tense. And most of my field work, I spent time in the land houses and Telecenter. So land houses are kind of like cyber cafes, but they go way beyond that. They become like a space for socializing. It's basically where people find safe space to be themselves, to fulfill their emotions. There's a lot of peer learning happening in those spaces. They were found as in extensions of people's homes. So they were owned by local residents of the favelas. And they situated right in the middle of the hill because that's where people lived. So I visited 2 land houses and 2 telecenters. In the book, I bring more findings from different land houses, but these are the land houses that I spend the most time. The same thing with telecenters. Telecenters were same thing, the computer lab. It was financed by the city government, so it was free for people to use. Land houses, you had to pay about 3 reais, which back then was about $1 an hour, or a little less than $1, whereas Telecenter was free to use. And they were situated, one right at the bottom, which had the easiest access, and the other one was situated right on the top of the hill, which was, of course, the hardest center to access, but yet it was a place where I was more integrated into the community, and it was where I got most of my interesting insights. Like I said, this is a long-term research. As the book is going to be published in 2022, then it's going to be a good landmark of the 10th year anniversary of the project, because I started doing exploratory field work in 2012. I did my long-term ethnography in 2013, and I came back for follow-up field work and interviews and whatnot. And of course, I also use Facebook as a way to communicate and stay in touch with my informants. So as I talked about the field and my framework, the mundane technologies, now I'm going to bring those together. I want to talk about the cases of mundane technologies in these favelas. And the one that I like the most, I mean, it's hard to pick one. It's like the cases become like your kids. It's hard to pick one, but selfies are the mundane technologies that I always like to talk about. So most residents in favelas, they posted selfies on their Facebook pages through Xinglings. So Xinglings were the Chinese knockoff smartphones. And they use those selfies to express their feelings without being too explicit with their opinions. Still, they found it difficult to express their true feelings because they were being judged as favelados, which is a derogatory term to refer to people in the favelas. And at the same time, they were judged by those that belong to upper classes and that were visiting their profile page to make fun of them. So they felt oppressed wherever they went. If they hung out in the favelas, they felt drug traffickers was watching them. If they traveled outside the favelas, they felt discriminated against by society and targeted by police. They considered Facebook a safer place to express their true feelings, thoughts, and personalities while escaping the drug traffickers' all-seeing eyes. So Jefferson, he was 17 years old. He described the context of his posting of a selfie on Facebook after surviving a terrible shooting in his neighborhood. He said, "Today I posted a photo of myself expressing my gratitude of being alive. I can't say much more than that because I'll have trouble with people involved in the shooting." So for Jefferson, taking and posting a selfie had nothing to do with narcissism or attention seeking. To the contrary, as a resident of a dangerous area run by drug traffickers, Jefferson wanted to escape public attention. His selfie was a strategic way to show his grief about the shooting he witnessed, disappointment about his current living situation, and expectation for a better life. His selfie practice was embedded in a social culturally dense context and could not be reduced to a simple act of self-promotion, the typical assumed purpose of a posted selfie, usually in Western societies. Similarly, Fernanda, 16 years old, one of the few informants with a shingling, posted a selfie showing her tears and anger right after the same shootout witnessed by Jefferson. Fernanda complained that she did not have the mental capacity to deal with the stress of having her life in daily jeopardy. As we were talking, I noticed a guy in his mid-20s standing just outside the land house. He kept looking at his phone and then at Fernanda, as if he wanted to make sure that the person he was looking at on the phone was her. He then caught her attention and asked her to step outside. It was a chilling moment because I knew he wasn't her friend, nor a frequent user of the land house. I was very scared about the situation, but she seemed fine. When she got back to the land house, she was rolling her eyes, saying, "Did you see that? He wanted to know what my selfie was about. He asked me if the selfie was related to the movimento of the drug cartel activity. I said no. I told him that the photo was about the fight I had with my boyfriend, and he believed me. My friends get me, and they know it is about the unbearable armed war. This is how we get to express ourselves here. We say a lot by hiding a bit." So the act of saying a lot by hiding a bit through selfies became a mundane technology the favela residents use to express their emotions. That is, the process of appropriating selfies to communicate a message with sufficient context removed allowed only those with knowledge of the person to understand the intended meaning. So Leo, 13 years old, he was a frequent user of Games Landhouse. He usually used his selfies for more informational purposes, to let his mom know where he was and to signal that he was safe. He said, "My mom works the entire day and I have nothing to do after work. I love playing soccer on the streets, but it is dangerous due to the drug street managers want new people in their team. I always post photos of myself to show my mom where I am and that I'm okay. She always checks her face, which is they used to call Facebook face, at work during her breaks. There's a computer that they can use." So it was interesting because I went to his Facebook timeline and it was all kinds of selfies of him at the Telecenter and the land houses to make sure that his mom would see, and his mom would always like to acknowledge to him that she saw it, and then she's more released. Another way that they used selfie was to bypass illiteracy. Unfortunately, illiteracy, it was a big problem and still is a big problem in favelas of Brazil. So they often use selfies to communicate with each other, to express their feelings, and also to make sure that people would understand what they wanted to say. Leo, for example, he couldn't read or write, but he still managed to post selfies as a way to communicate with his mom. So as I move forward from thinking about technology as digital artifacts or technological artifacts like selfies and smartphones, I move away a little bit to talk about how mundane technologies can also be seen as a process. And here I talk about repair and maintenance. So favelas are known to be the broken city, right? Because they live under constant infrastructural neglect. And here, and I have a whole chapter dedicated to this, I examine how repair sustains the everyday mundane technological lives of favela residents and how they liberate themselves from the oppression of infrastructural breakdown. So breakdown and failure are not deviations from upper class normality, as upper class Brazilians believe. Rather, I argue that breakdown and failure are how technologies most commonly encountered in everyday lives in the favelas. So infrastructural breakdown is not an exception to a normal state of continuity. Rather, it is the crucible in which the rhythms of everyday life must be forged. So Susan Lee Starr notes that the normally invisible quality of working infrastructure becomes visible when it breaks. But such claims beg the question, for whom does it become visible? So as I show in this part, it becomes visible to people who live in conditions of pervasive uncertainty. Favela residents are required to accumulate knowledge to simply get around in their everyday lives. So they had to engage in everyday repair and maintenance processes, as I call here, the thermodynamic technologies to just get by. I regard favela, even though favelas are seen as an area of, such as the part of the city which is broken, I regard favelas as a highly functioning environment, despite ongoing oppression, where residents rely on each other acts of solidarity and care to create function out of dysfunction. So now, due to the makeshift wire and pipe taps called Gatos, they affected the voltage running through the power lines to the land houses in people's homes. The fluctuated voltage damaged their computers, as Luis, the owner of the land house, explained. They say changing the light bulbs here is a freaking activity, but they are cheap. What really concerns me is how often the power supply units fry. Most of the time, I don't have money to buy a new one right away. So I have to put the computers away until I can buy a new power supply units. So they had to not only build a storage space in their land houses to store power supply units. And by the way, Americans often call this the fan, but this is basically what keeps your motherboard, your memories, and everything inside of a CPU from frying. So this is the first thing to fly if there's a electrical outage. And they had to build their own ways of fixing those power supply units because that was the crucial part of the computers that they really needed to keep the computers running. And it's important to notice that if the computer is not running, that affects their income, right? Because they rely on these computers for people to use and pay them for the hour. So, of course, the irregular and makeshift infrastructure of favelas also impacted the willingness of companies to provide services to customers who live there. So internet providers were unwilling to invest in the physical infrastructure necessary to deliver a reliable broadband connection. So Cyberland House owner Gustavo was forced to search for information on computer networking himself, pointedly noting that this task challenged the well-worn institutionalized neglect the favela had always been subjected to. Following his crash course on computer networking, Gustavo subscribed to a faster internet connection through his uncle's house located on the border of the favela, which is in a wealthier area, also better served neighborhood at the base of the hill. Gustavo used 15 Linksys routers placed inside plastic boxes on the light bulbs and 500 meters of Ethernet cable to connect to his LAN house. And he was able to distribute the internet that he got into his LAN house and distribute it to people who wanted to subscribe to that internet. So he charged them about 35 reais, which back then was approximately $10 a month, which was still not affordable by many people, but still much cheaper than the cost of a single subscription, which was 160 reais, which was about $46 per month for a subscription. So it was not just a matter of access in terms of money, right? Because there were people that could afford that subscription if the internet provider went in there. It was just that the internet providers were refusing to go to that field, claiming that it was not a profitable area for them to invest in infrastructure. So Gustavo was one example of how he had to rely on his repair and maintenance mundane technologies to bring internet not only to his land house, but also to his community. So oftentimes in the STS literature, we're concerned with large-scale infrastructures, but in this book, I also focus on how mundane technologies work on a smaller and more personal level. So infrastructure such as the keyboard, in focusing on smaller infrastructure like the keyboard, I believe makes it more suitable to understanding the intersecting scales of failure and reconstitution at play in small-scale technologies that saturate daily life in the favelas. So the QWERTY layout never made sense to them. And they had some thoughts about using the keyboard. They always thought it was very frustrating. They didn't understand why it was organized in a QWERTY layout. Even people outside the favelas have any idea of why we're so stuck with this very weird layout. But in summary, the QWERTY layout comes from typewriters, because back in the days, the layout was designed to improve typing in English in ways that the keys wouldn't get jammed if typing at the same time. So, which means that for those who don't know how a typewriter works, that if you push a bunch of buttons and as the thing punches the tape, and as you press a bunch of keys, it will get jammed, right? So to avoid keys to get jammed, then the QWERTY layout with the English language in mind was designed. And because people were so accustomed and used to use the QWERTY layout in the typewriter, then it was translated to computers' keyboards. Of course, now keys don't get jammed, so it doesn't really make sense, but because of historical reasons, then we got stuck with the QWERTY layout. Also, the typewriters were never part of the favela everyday life. So people never seen a keyboard like this one. And it became even more strange because ontologically, favela residents were accustomed to categorizing and organizing symbols in familiar ways, such alphabetical and numerical order. So seeing something like this, instead of inviting them to use the computers, it was actually push them away. And one way that I like to talk about this frustration is mentioning what Regina said. She said, I'm trying to learn how to use this thing, but it doesn't make sense. I waste so much time to write something because I can't find the right keys. It gets in the way of learning this thing. I feel angry and unmotivated, but that's okay because when I find the damn letter, I don't push it, I punch it. So she shows her frustrations about the keyboard. And I'll try to summarize here an interesting workshop that I did with favela residents in one of the telecenters is that we broke the layout apart, the keyboard apart, and asked them to organize, the layout according to their preferences. And surprisingly, but not very surprisingly, they wanted to have the keyboard on alphabetical order, not just because they were used to things being on alphabetical orders. It was just because the keyboards on the telecenters and land houses were so overused that the ink on each key would fade away really quickly, meaning that they couldn't really see where the A was or the B was. So having the layout in an alphabetical order, they had better chances of guessing where each key was, even if the ink will fade away from each key. For example, if the ink on the B key fades away, they could see that it was between the key A and the key C, hence the one in the middle is B. So that's why they really wanted the alphabetical order, not because it was in the most efficient way, but for the context, their context, it made a lot of sense. So it's that question that we always tell our students to ask in our social construction of technology. Like when developing a technology, we should always ask the question, it's best for whom. So here, that the QWERTY layout was not best for them at all. So I want to move forward to talk about the uses of technologies, one that allow these people to leave their field, to leave their favelas. So throughout the book and throughout this presentation, I talked about how they use their mundane technologies to get by and navigate through oppressions in their own terrain, in their own territory, right? So how do they manage oppression within their favelas? But in this chapter and for the rest of this talk, I want to bring a more explicit interrogation of geographies of oppression in favela life. I want to show how residents' mundane technologies encourage them to cross social boundaries. But I will also show what happens once they reach physical spaces that were not designed for them. And as you can guess, they experience prejudice from wealthy and upper class people who not only were unwilling to share the same offline spaces with them, but actively worked to oppress them. So throughout the book, I talk about the uses of technologies to navigate oppression within the favelas. But here I will talk about what happens when technology empowers them to organize themselves and to leave those spaces. But then what happens when they leave the favelas? So think about that avenue that I just mentioned in the map before. So I want to talk about the famosinhos, or the famous teenagers. Famosinhos became a popular term in Brazil's periphery in 2013. The term referred to teenagers whose presence on social media made them famous among their fans. In Territory of Good, the favelas, famosinhos were the most popular teenagers who dictated teen fashion trends and playlists. They actively cultivated their reputations by posting videos with dance moves known as passinho and memes to show off their apparel. The famosinhos often watched YouTube videos to learn new passinhos or new dance moves and try to replicate them in the Telecenter's waiting room. Famosinhos worked hard to create digital content that showed off their Nike or Puma shoes, brand name t-shirts such as Lacoste or Polo, and sometimes thick gold necklace, as mentioned by João. They say that being famous on Facebook is like being rich in the board game Monopoly. The money is useless, but it doesn't matter because I have this showing his t-shirt and his shoes. I want to be like those MCs from Funk Consultation. My fans look up to me, give me lots of respect, and I earned it. I spent several hours at the Telecenter and attended the workshops to learn new tools to be creative. Now I can make videos and talk for my peers about what we want and what we need. Being a famosinho also gives me the opportunity to fight for what we want. So famosinhos from all over Brazil organized events on Facebook so they could hang out with their friends and meet their fans in public spaces, especially in places outside the periphery like shopping malls. These meetups were called rolezinhos, or little strolls. In October of 2013, rolezinhos started to take place at malls throughout the country. Although rolezinhos became famous for occupying malls, João's first meetups took place in the local square known as Pracinha. The friends and fans of João joined his rolezinhos to sing and listen to funk, to meet other teenagers and make out and hang out with them, and to just goof around. As João's rolezinhos gained popularity, he felt more confident and empowered, which drove him to organize his next meetup at Shopping Vitoria, which was the main shopping mall in the city. He told me, "You can see that this week's rolezinho at Pracinha was much more crowded. Man, I'm becoming like a real celebrity. With a large group, I won't be afraid of hanging at the mall, at the Shopping Vitoria. We can totally go up to the mall and no one will mess with us. So in Brazil, shopping malls went beyond being places to be entertained, hang out, and shop. They were places where the upper class showed its purchasing power and social location. In other words, malls were a space for the white and rich in Brazil. On November 30th of 2013, João assembled 6 of his friends at the square where they usually met and took the bus to shopping Vitoria. The mall was centrally located in the city, which was outside the favelas, which meant that they had to cross that avenue, Leitão da Silva. This road served as a symbolic social boundary that separated the poor and Black areas from wealthy and white areas of Vitoria, where shopping Vitoria was. Before João and his Rolezinho had arrived at shopping Vitoria, a much larger group organized on Facebook was already gathering just outside the mall. The purpose of the meetup was to meet new people and socialize. So about 400 people showed up, mostly Black teenagers and young adults from the peripheries in Vitoria. The partygoers were playing funk music and having fun. Everything was peaceful until the military police showed up. The environment became very tense as the participants were rightfully bothered by their presence. As the meetup got more tense, the roar of motorcycles driving by was mistaken for gunshots. Fearing that an attack from the officers was imminent, the meetup participants got scared and rushed inside the shop in Vitoria to find shelter and safety. Upon entering the mall, the Black young men were chased by the military police, scaring the people who were already inside the mall and causing a stampede. The military police occupied the mall and initiated an arbitrary procedure of approaching and detaining Black young men who looked like a favelado. That was when the officers grabbed João and his friends. Even after they searched them and found that they had not committed any crime, they took João's group to the food court of the mall, then made them remove their shirts and sit on the floor with their hands clasped on their back of the necks. They were surrounded at gunpoint by police officers. After that, all the Black young men were lined up and forced to put their hands on each other's shoulders. Military police marched them to exit a public space, even though no crime was committed. Mall goers photographed and filmed the whole event, later posting the scenes on Facebook. These mall goers, mostly upper class and white, did not have to face the same suspicion, search, and humiliation at the hands of the police. They actually supported the police brutality by applauding the police and booing the Black young men as they were first forced out of the mall. João and his friends regrouped after the police officers marched them out. João protested tearfully, saying, "I don't even need to say anything. This is what happens when a Black favelado goes to a shopping. Do you think this would have happened to us if we were white?" So the interesting question that he brought later, it really caught my attention. He said, what is the point of being a famosinho? What is the point of knowing how to create digital content? What is the point of all this if people will still look down on me simply because I'm Black? Which this challenges this idea of digital inclusion, right? What is the point of including, the Blacks and poor if when they finally feel empowered to occupy spaces that they have been historically excluded, then they have to face all kinds of prejudice and police brutality. So what is the point of all this, right? So the discrimination, which was driven by racism and classism, is deeply rooted in Brazil society. So to think that technology will solve these problems or to make things easier is a myth. Actually, these technologies amplify such prejudice. So even though João considered his Rolezinho a complete failure, his Rolezinho was actually a statement of perseverance, since they were seen as they confronted social and racial invisibility. Silvana, which was one of the friends who joined João at the mall, said that they intend to remain daring and persistent until they got what they wanted, which was just to have fun. From the insistence of these acts, we can pass from the discomfort and tension revealed in the Holazinho to a more inclusive and democratic society. We should remember that it was the refusal of Black people to give up their seats to white people on buses and in diners that catalyzed the US-American civil rights movement more than 50 years ago. Daily actions and mundane technologies challenge the limits of social segregation and can benefit our society and ultimately reduce inequality and strengthen our democracy. These daily actions often place people at a significant risk of physical and institutional harm. But for this reason, it is important to emphasize the acts of insistence like Holazinho's to fight discrimination against Black people in Brazil and sit-ins in the US. They can generate positive press for protesters and rally others to their cause, pursuing the state to change its oppressive ways, and hopefully bringing society to a more inclusive and dignifying state. With that, I finished today's presentation. Thank you so much for your time, and yeah, let's go for the questions.
Thank you so much, Professor. This was very illuminating and very rich with information and insights. I really appreciate your talk. I'm sure our attendees have a lot of questions like I do. So if you can send them in the Q&A tool at Zoom, we can get the ball rolling. So I have a lot of questions, but I want to start with something that was in the news a few days ago, not only in the news, but in our lives, because a few days ago we had a global outage of Facebook services, and Facebook owns WhatsApp and everything else. So I would imagine that this had an impact in these social processes that you described. And I wonder if you could speak about that a little bit, particularly to the dependence that we have on these platform or these one or two platforms, right? And what do these people do in such events? And maybe what are the implications for policy there, right? Are there any solutions that we can think?
Thank you, Danielle. It's a very good question. So in this talk here, I do not talk about the technology of the oppressor, which is a chapter that I dedicated to how the oppressor used technology to oppress. So that's when I talk about the uses of WhatsApp, Facebook, and the rise of far-right governments like Bolsonaro, which in turn becomes an even more oppressive government towards these people in the favelas. The reason I chose to not talk about this now, because it would take forever, and I feel like most people are tired of me talking about fake news. But this is a good question because I can touch on that. So Facebook has this thing called Free Basics. So Free Basics follows the zero rating politics, basically that Facebook will get into kind of agreements, and this is where the tricky part is, because these agreements are not formal agreements, and we can't really say that Facebook is causing this, so they're very smart about these things. So basically they get into these weird agreements where telecoms will give people free access to data as long as they only use Facebook platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. So it's not a surprise that all of a sudden these platforms became very well diffused within not only Brazil, but most developing countries. The practice of zero rating became known as digital colonialism, because basically they were giving like free access and people were raving about this. They thought it was great, but in exchange, people were just giving, free data giving back their data to Facebook, because these were markets that Facebook didn't really know much. So there was a good way to extract data from developing countries. So as smartphones became more like a reality and more affordable to folks in marginalized communities, then they couldn't really afford a data plan. So they signed up for the zero rating plans, which was free, and they could use Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram for free, which meant that, all of a sudden WhatsApp became the #1 social media tool or app in Brazil. About 130 million Brazilians are active on WhatsApp. This is more than half the population. And 96% of these 130 million use WhatsApp as their main channel of communication, which means, WhatsApp is the official communication tool in Brazil. So not only it's an app, it's a utility. So people, schedule their COVID tests on WhatsApp. That's how they talk to family, friends, especially in times of pandemic and social distancing, then becomes even more like a vital tool. So with this outage, and this blackout promoted by Facebook, that happened due to a technical difficulty, then you really became aware that people was very dependent on this. And what was interesting was that people were restarting their phones and restarting their modems and routers because they thought the internet was out. And they didn't know the difference between the internet and Facebook. To them, Facebook and their platforms are actually the internet, which is a very dangerous thing because, Facebook is a private for-profit company, whereas the internet is supposed to be this open platform. But unfortunately, Facebook is doing everything they can to close it and have people locked into their platforms and and apps. So it became very obvious, and of course, people lost the ways of communicating for 6 hours. They were raging against these things, but they didn't really reflect on the consequences of making those apps so vital to their everyday lives. So this calls for policies to not only end this idea of zero rating programs, but also look into how Facebook is becoming a monopoly in many countries in the world. So this calls for these actions and political actions as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. We're almost out of time, but we have interesting questions, and if we can bear with us, we can try to get to all of them. First, we have a question from Dr. Lucia Magis-Weinberg saying, fantastic talk, thank you. How has the rapid expansion of mobile smartphones impacted the dynamics around land centers and the community?
This is a great question. Thank you, Lucia. In the book, I expand this more because the telecenters and land houses, although for outsiders, they're just seen as computer labs. In my ethnography, I approach them as community centers. So for example, there was one time that there was a shooting happening, and then everybody rushed into a land house. And later I asked, why is that? And they said, well, land houses here are considered sacred, just like the school and the church. Nobody will come here and cause any trouble. This is why, for example, the mother of Leo left him in the land house because it was safe for him to be there and not be recruited. There was so much sociality and social norms being created in these spaces that it went way beyond being a computer lab. They were community centers. So in the book, I explained that they were complementary. So phones, although they couldn't afford, like I said before, data plans, so they went to these centers to use the Wi-Fi and take advantage of this open internet. The land houses would still charge a fraction of real because Wi-Fi was cheaper, but in the telecenter, the Wi-Fi was open, so they had to go there to use the Wi-Fi. So even though we're developing technologies to become this individual and experience, but in the favelas, these spaces became vital to the community life. And also like they were reinventing those spaces all the time. Like land house owners turned their land houses as the place where people go to fix their computers. So the land house owners will fix people's computers, will fix people's phones. So, you know, it's a clear case of boundary object in the sense that these spaces were plastic enough to adapt themselves to the current situation that they were living. So instead of putting them at a rivalry or competing position, they were much more complementary to the socio-technical experience of the people in the favelas. So yes, it was very complementary. So it's a very good question. Thank you.
We have a question from Salvatore Solimano saying he's interested in your work in pro Bolsonaro WhatsApp ecosystem and ethnographies in Brazil. And he says he's particularly interested in your methods. Are there issues that you choose to study entirely digitally? And how do you not confuse digital versus analog phenomena?
Thank you, Mona. So this is a duality that I try to avoid because I see them as being complementary. And I'll say this because once I lived in Vitoria, I was doing this in-person ethnographic work. And one of the challenges that ethnographers usually encounter is when they have to detach themselves and leave the field. That's why it's very common to see ethnographers just stay in the field because they feel so compelled to the community that they're working with. Facebook helped me this transition of leaving and going back to Indiana to finish my dissertation. For example, the Rolezinho event that I just mentioned, it happened after I left. So Facebook worked as a tool for them to tell me what was happening at that moment. So João could tell me the frustration and send me photos of him crying. So that helped a lot. With the WhatsApp research, it was entirely done online, especially because given the circumstances that Brazil was situated in, and also had to do with the object of the study, specifically about WhatsApp, because I was looking into the ways that people were organizing themselves to promote misinformation. So in the book, I talk about this human infrastructure that was put into place to disseminate and create misinformation. So I don't see them computing, but rather informing each other. You know, just like the never-ending debate about qualitative versus quantitative, which, you know, they're more complementary than computing. And also they answer different questions. So I think that the digital, given the affordances of the technologies, you are able to do certain types of research, or you're able to answer certain types of questions, whereas the analog, you're allowed to ask different questions and get different answers. So they complement each other just because they see things in different perspective.
Thanks for that. We have a question from our good friend and also Brazilian Victor. Thank you for such a great talk. In your view, what has been the role of Brazilian security forces, police and military, in promoting or even imposing far-right viewpoints among favela residents? Do you see them weaponizing WhatsApp or social media for political purposes while surveilling these territories?
Hi, Victor. Sometimes we exchange notes on Facebook. Good to have you here. No, this is a very good question. I see them using WhatsApp mainly to impose their far-right views. I haven't seen much about surveillance on WhatsApp. I've seen surveillance on Facebook, but because there is this larger migration from Facebook to WhatsApp, then I haven't really encountered much of surveillance in them, especially because given the encryption and the possibility of meeting in smaller groups, then they don't feel surveilled on WhatsApp, and also haven't seen any efforts to keep track of them. But it is certainly, it has become one of the main channels to promote the far-right ideologies, as we know, not just the military, but also favela, the far-right government of Bolsonaro. What is interesting, though, is something that I realized was that the information resilience that favela residents had was much more powerful than the information resilience those in upper classes, meaning that they were less likely to believe in misinformation than those in upper classes. Because oftentimes we get told that it's a matter of media literacy or even access to education, which is not true. If we look into who is actually spreading and consuming misinformation, are those in the upper class. Favela residents, because they had to build their own understanding of information throughout their lives with a grain of salt, because people are there to get them and they know this. So they knew that the information everywhere, not just on WhatsApp, had to be absorbed critically. So they were much more resilient in believing these things than those in the upper classes. So this is just an observation to this weaponizing WhatsApp. Didn't quite work for them. It worked for those in the upper classes.
All right. Thank you very much, David, for a fascinating, absolutely fascinating seminar. Thank you, Daniel, for great moderation. Thank both of you for staying extra time to answer all the questions that we had from our highly engaged audience. Thanks, everybody in the audience, for staying with us to the end. I want to invite you again for next week's seminar featuring another Brazilian, Mauro Porto, from Tulane University. So we are staying with our great friends from Brazil. And I hope everybody has a great rest of your weeks. And I will see you all here in the new installment of the virtual seminar series of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Goodbye.